Hello. I hope your week is going smoothly. Today, we're going to talk about the language of describing art and using that language to start analyzing what you see. When you use your senses to perceive something or you specifically look at something, you enter a relationship of sorts with that thing or entity. You perceive, you interact with, you look at, you take in that information, you process that information, and you decide what you're going to do with that information. Sometimes this is a matter of seconds or a fraction of a second. Sometimes that is a more extensive or involved framework for your decision making process. Perhaps you decide that your shoes do not go with the outfit that you have planned. Or in the morning, you look out the window or you check your weather app and you decide that you need to pack an umbrella in your book bag. Or you have gone out and you realize everyone else has an umbrella and you do not have an umbrella and you are now getting rained on. You realize that you could have planned better, or you realize that you forgot your umbrella that thought you needed, you thought you had packed or that you needed to pack. You might give people directions to a location by visual landmark in addition to street names. You might match teaspoons to the other teaspoons in your silverware divider in your drawer or on your counter. Or maybe you mix them all together and you don't match them together. Or perhaps your you notice that your plant is getting a little crispy, say, like this example here, or it's turning funky colors. You realize that you might need to adjust or make adjustments to light, food, or water and nutrition levels for your plant so it can thrive. You might decorate your objects or living and working spaces to suit your personal preferences, style, organizational needs, and other functions that you need to thrive in those spaces. Perhaps you cover your laptop with stickers about things you're interested in, or you choose particular color palettes and materials to organize your bedroom or living room or your dorm room, or your desk at your office. You hang posters, you pick a particular lamp, or you get plants to decorate your space. You get particular baskets, bins, or other organizers to store your stuff. All of these things meet your needs and they communicate certain things about you as an individual to people that you invite into your space. They tell visitors to your spaces that you are perhaps interested in particular kinds of things or media if you display certain kinds of books, games, movies in your space where other people can see them. We engage with visual content every day, or some of us are excluded from engaging with visual content every day. And that content is used to communicate ideas through a network of people and places, from your domestic spaces all the way to the smaller community level, national level, and international networks of information. Art historians and other kinds of visual culture specialists, marketing specialists, designers, psychologists, and all kinds of other professions take extended time to look at objects and to understand the visual and material rhetoric, the visual and material language applied to the composition of those things, and how combinations of elements or components impact the viewer or indicate meaning or function in various circumstances. It can be quite difficult to take in all of the relevant details of an object, space, or image all in one go. So we're not going to do it all in one go. Throughout the term, we'll be progressing through a number of steps and some specific vocabulary to help us analyze artwork from different perspectives. These steps include identification of the object, assessment of material and visual properties, identification of content, interpretation of what you see, and integration of all of that visual and material information within historical, social, and cultural contexts. So from the list on your screen, we'll be starting with items number one, two, three, and four this week and next week. And in the remainder of the term, we will be working on looking at how visual properties and of examples from objects around the world, different regions of the world, fit into the social, historical, and cultural values of those specific regions or communities around the world. When we analyze art, we usually start by collecting what superficial information we can about a thing. In this class, you generally will not have any major mysteries about the basic category of a thing. And this will often be provided in the form, this introductory information will often be provided in the form of a label with the object. On whether that's a label with the object on the screen while you're listening to lecture, or on a museum website or gallery website, or in a physical museum or gallery space. When you look at an object on display in a museum's website, typically they'll give you a label that has some very basic information, starting with the artist's name, if there is a known artist, maker, designer, or fabricator. Here in this case, we have Julianne Harvey, and that is followed by the object title. Here it is a thematic title, housewarming, and but in other instances, that might just be a title that describes what kind of object it is: a piece of flatware, a specific kind of textile, a style of shoe, a kind of ceramic vessel, or a piece of furniture like a sofa or a chair in a particular style. So titles can be thematic or descriptive depending on what the thing is and how it is placed within the collection and the story of and history of the collection. The title is here followed by a date, 1996, a specific year in this instance. Sometimes you will see a range of years, perhaps 2 or 3 years, 1996 to 1998, or you might see a whole century, the 19th century or the 1800s. You might see a range of centuries. The label might say circa the 11th century to the 13th century. So you will either get a very specific idea of when a thing is made or a more approximate time frame for when a thing is made. The date is typically followed by the medium, in this case, raku fired ceramic, and that tells us that this is a clay vessel that has been fired or dried out and processed in a kiln to a particular effect. So we know what it is, we know a certain title, we know when it was made, and we know who made it. Typically, when we are documenting artworks for our own analysis, we will often end the label with a reminder about what collection the object came from. So I've listed here that housewarming came from the Albuquerque Museum in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so that gives us an introduction to what this thing is. On the labels in either virtual or physical museum spaces, you will sometimes find a brief descriptive blurb or paragraph that might tell you a little bit more about how the museum has interpreted the label or how that object came to be in the collection, or how it works in relationship to the other objects that the artist has made, or perhaps some brief biographical information about the artist or maker. So on the pictured label here, you see such a paragraph that tells us a little bit more about the object. It is usually not every possible thing about the object, and often it is a very limited description of what you physically see in the object. So we still might have to look or use other skills and observation skills and research to find out more or to make sense about the object. But these labels give us a starting point. So when you go to a museum website, do not ignore these details. They are very important for help giving you a starting point. It is not everything, but it is a start. Medium, or the materials, technique, and format used to make an object, impacts how we can experience, observe, or interact with an object. Here we have 3 examples of human figures made with 3 different media, and you can see that they look pretty radically different, even as the composition is relatively similar. They aren't exactly the same, but we have 3 human figures in roughly the same configuration. You can see that the fresco to your left, which is a medium in which pigment, powdered or liquid pigment, is mixed directly into wet plaster on a surface. And you can see here that the color of this figure is much more muted because plaster is usually a pale neutral tone, usually a white, gray, or kind of beigey color depending on its base mixture. It will tone down the pigment that is mixed in with it. So it takes more pigment to get intense colors. This example is also a little worn from age, but you can see that even the green here, the most intense color in the composition, is still pretty muted. And we have a lot of other muted tones or colors in the composition, whereas the mosaic and stained glass to the far right are much more intense displays of color. In the case of the mosaic, which uses little pieces known as tesserae, which is little pieces of glass, tile, precious gem, pieces of metal, and what other materials might be available or commissioned to be used in the design, um, are direct displays of the color of those objects. We don't have anything muting or toning down that color. So where we see the metallic gold finish, that is literally pieces of precious metal, and light is reflecting off of that surface. We have chunks of lapis lazuli, a precious gemstone, where you see the blue. We have red stones at the red, and so on and so forth. This means that we have both the base color of the object and the light from the space adds a reflective element to a lot of these materials. So we have a rich intensity of color. We also, because these are made with little individual pieces of material, the tesserae, you see little gaps between each of the pieces. So we inherently have a kind of blockier or rougher texture to the surface. The lines aren't as smooth. The gap is not large in this case. It can be much bigger. For example, the tiles in bathrooms or kitchens often have slightly larger grout lines for basic designs, but it creates texture and does not create such a fluid design for us to look at. And whereas in the stained glass to your right, we have a transparent surface that has had translucent pigment layered on top of it, or mixed into the glass. So we have light projecting through that, and that color is then projected into space. So we see that intensity of color both in the window when we are looking at it, or through the pane of glass or piece of glass as we are looking at it. And it also projects an additional kind of color experience, adapts to the space inside. Um, so we but we are adding the pigment directly to the glass. So we have that intensity of color, but still the option for a more fluid line and shape, as you see in this example. And these are just 3 examples of media. Any example we look at will impact the specifics of how we use or interact with that object. The size and scale of objects also impacts the way that we can interact with them. For example, on the screen to your left, you see an itty bitty book, a miniature book. Note the thumbs for scale. Um, that is incredibly small in scale in comparison to the human body using it. This is a more intimate experience of reading and viewing an object. Likely only one person can interact with it at once. Um, Perhaps not unlike having to huddle around someone's phone screen versus having airdropping a link to a specific page so multiple people can comfortably view something at once. So things that are individual and at a small scale can often only be viewed by one person at a time versus something that is larger in scale. For example, on the screen to your right, we have one of Klaus van Oldenburg's giant shuttlecocks, in which the shuttlecock, the badminton birdie, is scaled up to the size of a building, or nearly the size of the building. And you can see to the left of that image a very small fraction of the other badminton birdie that also lives on the lawn of the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas. So we see, and in this case, we see something that must be viewed at a distance to see the full effect of the image. These badminton birdies that a single human could not use, but perhaps a giant or some other mythical creature might use to play a game on the lawn of this building, using the art museum itself as the net. So scale changes the way that we can interact with an object pretty radically. In addition to medium, size, and location, we have some other vocabulary that can help us learn more about an object and how it communicates information about meaning and function. These include two categories of terms known as the elements and principles of design. You might also see them listed in other places as the elements and principles of art, or the elements and principles of composition, and a few other variations. We'll start with the elements of design. You can think of the elements of design as the Legos, or the building blocks, if you will, of all visual and material compositions. These include things like line, shape, form, light, color, value, mass and volume, space, texture, and time, and how those components appear in the object that you are looking at. For example, in the pictured composition to the bottom of the screen, we see a series of yellow and brown blocks rather, with a round block at the top in the shape of an eyeball, because the overall arrangement of these blocks is kind of elongated, with and a quadruped animal, we know that this might be a giraffe or some other quadruped with a really long neck and proportionally shorter limbs. We know that the green and brown thing to the right is probably not the same thing, because of other information that we might have in our brain, the kind of organic shape, the less geometric shape, certainly, with tones of green, with brown on the bottom, suggests that this giraffe is next to a tree. Maybe it's about to chow down for dinner. Maybe it's just hanging out by a tree. But we get visual cues about what the thing is based on the organization of the elements of design. And to complement that, we have the category known as the principles of design, and these include balance, contrast, emphasis or focal point, pattern, rhythm, proportion, scale, unity, and variety. So in our Lego example in this frame, we see that the composition is relatively balanced, or nearly symmetrically balanced. We can divide it roughly down the middle. And we see that the Lego minifigs on display in this model of a car for the London Underground, the London subway system, we see that these figures are not necessarily interacting with each other. We also see that the minifigs in this train car are not proportional to the scale of the train car. The figures are almost hitting the roof of the train car, which is not generally the amount of overhead that we see in one of these subway cars. There's usually a bit more clearance than that. So we see the scale has put them out of proportion with the space that they are in. So we are emphasizing the figures using the space rather than an accurate representation of a human scale train car. And we see that we have a pattern of minifigs, a zigzag pattern of our, starting with our Shakespeare minifig, going back to our figure with the crown. It looks like the shape of the hair suggests that it is the now deceased Queen Elizabeth. And then we zigzag up to the guard, and then we zigzag back, and that pattern moves us throughout the car. So we see more of the details in this space that is built out of Legos. So we have the principles of design, which talk about the organization of the space. So we now have some terms to help us describe what we're looking at in more detail. And I'm now going to move on to some more examples to describe some things in more detail or depth. Here we have our first example, and I would like you to pause and take a minute or 30 seconds to think about what you see pictured on the screen. Your brain likely took you a number of possible places, depending on how you think or what you noticed first or what stood out to you first. You might have started with the human or humanoid figures, or some sort of narrative, or hey, those are Legos again, or hey, bright colors. maybe something else. Typically, when there are human or humanoid figures or animal figures, your brain will often start trying to pick apart a story or narrative that might be going on before it moves on to anything else. But you might have started elsewhere besides that option. So, what do we have? So we have some sort of narrative at play here. One supersized Lego minifig dressed as a member of parliament, because of the organic shape of the um, white powdered wig that parliamentarians wear in the UK. And we see that that member of parliament is about to throw a pie at another supersized Lego minifig who is accessorized as a cop in this instance. So we have this narrative that might stand out to your brain when you look at something. But how do we know this, or what information are we processing to get that narrative? Line is an incredibly important component to this composition, beginning with the ways the minifigs are arranged. The Lego figurines are arranged, we see that they are the minifig, the cop, in the foreground, and the member of parliament in the midground are in a diagonal with each other, and also that diagonal line traces back to the intense red phone box in the background. So these figures form a diagonal line through roughly the middle of the composition at a diagonal. This means that we are using or being guided by asymmetrical balance or composition. So everything is slightly unstable or and constantly slightly wobbly seeming. Nothing is entirely flat on or against any given surface, because of the way the composition is arranged. That diagonal line makes sure that we can see everything, all of the action about to happen, and we know that the member of parliament is about to throw the pie also because of diagonal lines. If we look at the member of parliament's arm at the midground, you will see that um, his arm is at a diagonal. It is not resting at a side. At his side, it's not propped up on another surface. It is raised at a diagonal, so that we know that that pie is about to be in motion. The pie is also tilted at a diagonal. If you look at the X lines drawn um, across its central points, we see that it is tilted, and because of the direction of the line of sight of the member of parliament and the direction of its body and the direction of tilt of the pie, we know that the pie is about to be flung forward, which means that if there's enough force behind that pie, it is going to hit the person that it is being directed towards, or it might just flop in the middle. But we know that that pie is about to be in motion. We are implying motion, we and kinetic energy through the use of line. Color also helps guide us through the space. Um, it Color complements the line in this example. You might have been drawn first to the intense red telephone box in the background, and then you might have noticed everything else. But we are drawn to bright colors, and they tend to emphasize certain parts of composition. And because of that red's location in the background, it draws us through the entirety of the narrative. So we notice the red, and then we might bounce back to the figures in their narrative. The red also helps unify the composition. We have the intense red of the telephone box and little stripes of red in the scarf of the member of parliament. So we have these stable elements to counterbalance all of, or balance out the strong motion, strong constant motion of all of those diagonal lines everywhere. It offers a sense of stability, as does the repetition of yellow, the yellow bodies of the minifigs, the yellow of the wall, and the yellow detail of part of the flooring in this scene. So we use repetition of localized areas of color to stabilize the busy line that is bouncing us around everywhere in the composition. And now we have a few more examples on our subsequent slides. Here we have our second example, or rather two examples. And again, I would like you to pause for a few seconds or a minute or two and think about what you see depicted on the screen. So, what do we see here? You probably recognize that once again we have human figures being depicted in different ways, perhaps two figures moving or dancing. But are these figures performing the same quality or kind of movement? And as the magic 8 ball pictured to the right of the screen notes, that no, you probably recognize these as different qualities of movement. And again, it is line and shape that help us discern that these are different qualities of movement being presented. So in the example to your left, we have repetition of a number of circular shapes that you can see here in multiple spots on the frame. The floral decoration depicted on one edge of the image, or one edge of the performer's outfit is arranged in a curve. The edges of the fabric are curved lines. We don't have really any strong horizontal or vertical that stabilizes us. Everything is curving, swirling, and constantly moving as if this figure might be spinning around in motion. Contrastingly, the other figure is a series of rigid lines, or kind of a zigzag pattern in most of the composition. We see square edges, which I did not draw that correctly, but we see square 90-degree angles layered in different parts of the image. We see sharp angles and rigid lines throughout the image. We do see that broken up with some softer curving lines in some places, so we know that we are not totally rigid and in place, but this is a very different kind of movement. Perhaps you might read it as more aggressive, or at least certainly perhaps jerkier, or more stop and go in style. Um, if we were furthering those ideas, we might also read the floral patterns versus the kind of stronger floral patterns and organic shapes in one side in comparison to the zigzag or stronger shapes on the other side. We might read them as more perhaps feminine or masculine in certain binaries, but we see similar compositions and color palettes of figures used to create radically different meaning. Those same elements and principles of design can help us sift through an array of emotions and body language and reading reading those to produce meaning in the work and to figure out why we are perceiving certain meaning from the work. For example, grief or mourning depicted here in Katakalwit's Woman with Dead Child from 1903. We see a figure holding the limp body of another figure, a quite smooth and youthful looking figure, so a child, as the title suggests. But this is more than just someone holding a corpse, a dead body. It is a highly emotional scene layered onto that iconography of bodies. We see the artist using levels of detail in the shape and line to draw us towards the center of the image, towards the faces and hands. We see the hand of the larger body grasping, gripping into pressing into the smaller body, the body of the child. You can see around the outline of the hand that there are lines and shading or shadow indicating that the larger figure is pressing into the flesh of the child, the smaller figure. And that, so we see that this is a very intense scene. And on top of that, we see that the body of the larger figure, the shape of the larger figure, is curled over that smaller body. We don't see the facial expression of the figure, but the whole body of this person is literally contorted. So we have that intense scene depicted with the most detail at the center of the image, and then everything from there fades into a kind of smudgy sense of less detail. The lines start to get wider and smudgier. It looks like we've got even some over towards the right center of the image. It looks like we've got some fingerprints, which is not uncommon for Kolwitz's work. We see the background is a kind of uneven set of smudgy marks. We are not in a specific space. This is about mourning and grieving, and the intensity of that emotion. Moving on to a three-dimensional composition, we have Merritt Oppenheim's Object from 1936, which, as you might notice, is a fur-covered cup, saucer, and spoon. Many of us have items like teacups or coffee mugs or other forms of drinking vessels in our homes, or we use them in different locations on a pretty regular basis if we do not have a teacup or coffee mug in our direct possession. But most of us do not think of these things as being covered in fur. How would you feel about having to use an object like this covered in a layer of fur or fleece or other textured fabric layer on top of your teacup or the lid of your travel mug? Most of us might probably entirely try to figure out how to skip that experience because we do not want the sensation of fur in our mouths, or we would imagine not being able to appropriately clean or sanitize such an object. But it might have also drawn out a visceral response of yuck or disgust at having to put wet fur next to or into your mouth as you consume the liquid stored or served in that vessel. So artists, or makers, designers can combine objects in expected or unexpected ways to evoke um, emotions in us or to draw out specific kinds of responses from us. Merritt Oppenheim, in combining these unexpected sets of surface texture and layered onto common items, creates an object that defies its utilitarian function or evokes a sense of disgust in us. If we imagine trying to make do with these versions of the utilitarian objects. And visual analysis works even when we do have the more expected forms of household items, such as plates, flatware, utensils, linens, textiles, um, and other furniture and decor you might have around your living space. So here we have an example of a blackware plate made by the ceramicist Maria Martinez and her son or son-in-law Julian Martinez, made in the 1930s. So blackware means that there's a layer of black glaze in the background, and the foreground is also a black design in a different texture of black glaze. So we see a very subtle variation of textures. So I've adjusted the contrast for us in this example so we see more clarity of the design that is being covered in the pattern. So we have a circular plate, a pretty simplistic design, an expected design or shape for such a vessel. But we have that circle complemented by the repetition of these thin bands of circles around the edge. So that creates this strong, stable edge that makes the walls of or the surface of the plate look a little bit thicker or sturdier, beyond the fact that the heft of the plate is quite thick, or the dimension of the plate is pretty thick or hefty. So we have this added visual stability, and we have that complemented with the variation of these strong designs across the center part of the plate. We have a alternating pattern of elements, including the shape or form in the triangular wedge-shaped components, repeated 4 times, and that is interspersed with these kind of strong linear elements between them. So we have the repetition of these circular lines around the surface, and then we create more visual interest by the alternating pattern of these other elements. And these other elements also complement the idea of clay, or earth we see in the wedge-shaped elements or components, um, a kind of mountain shape or a reference to the rolling shape of the landscape, perhaps. So we see these references to land and the place from which the clay came from, or you might see more of a claw, or animalistic shape, perhaps. But we have these other subtle references to the land and space around us, that you might dig further into. In visual analysis, we're kind of hampered from going further, but you might recognize these elements of landscape. And then later, when we dig into research, or when I probably tell you more about Maria Martinez in a couple of weeks in one of my lectures, you can learn more and start combining all of these pieces together. So through visual analysis, through the vocabulary of the elements and principles of design, you can begin breaking down in great detail the world around you and understanding visually how all of these parts are put together, how the designs and decorations and spaces, how buildings are designed to make you feel a certain way because of size and scale, how visual art that people display in spaces is designed to pull out emotions or to try to get you to respond in a particular ways. These are simple terms, but they allow us to dive much deeper into the composition, into the way the world works. So until next time, have a good week.